we go to Campbell, this National Cabinet met last Friday for the 27th time to work out a solution to these border closures. There's no scientific justification for border closures, nowhere. In fact, leading world authorities say they shouldn't exist, including Professor Michael Levitt, I might add, from Stanford University, a world-regarded epidemiologist, but what would he know? The best Scott Morrison got was some wishy-washy down-the-track promise by rogue premiers to maybe, just maybe, reopen the borders in time for Christmas. Again, no consensus between the states. And after all the media hype leading into this National Cabinet meeting, there was no consensus on what the definition of a hotspot would be. Mr Morrison said he put forward a definition and the states were viewing it as a starting point. Prime Minister, this National Cabinet is a failure with a capital F. Get rid of the thing. Anyway, let's go to Campbell. Campbell, what do you make of all of this in relation to a National Cabinet? People are sick of it, aren't they? 27th National Cabinet meeting, what's it achieved?
Well, Alan, I think that it is a sham, and I don't think it's working at all. And sadly for the Prime Minister, I think as time ticks on, it will end up making him look politically weak. He's riding high in the polls at the moment, but I think it will make him look ineffectual. Dennis Shanahan, the respected journalist of The Australian, wrote a very interesting piece in the last few days, which I agree with mostly, and he was pointing out that bit about political weakness. The thing I didn't agree with is he was saying the Prime Minister didn't have power, didn't have levers. He has a lot of levers. He just needs to decide to pull those levers and get these premiers into line.
Yeah, I mean, all he's doing here is elevating the power of the premiers, and you can see that every day, but he is perceived as weak. There is a crisis across the country that the public understand. People can't move. There's no movement across borders. There are states with no coronavirus cases where you can't go. And they're saying, well, Prime Minister, you're the Prime Minister of the country. What are you doing? Now, while ever he's seen to do nothing, he must be seen as being weak. It's very damaging to him.
It is damaging, Alan, and I've been saying it since April, that ultimately the economic wreckage, the carnage caused by COVID-19 and the response, particularly from these state premiers and territory first ministers, is something that will fall on the shoulders of Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg. And I don't think they've been really, well, they must know that, but I just don't think they've really sort of woken up and smelt the coffee. They will wear it. As you've just said, the whole issue about going to a National Cabinet meeting and not having a decision, not having a clear-cut answer. I mean, I'd like to see the PM really strong-arm these people. You mentioned the GST before. What about legal sort of remedies? I mean, there are a number of different hooks in the Constitution about external affairs powers, international treaties. It could be about trade and commerce. It could be about human rights, where, you know, if the Prime Minister was serious, he could wheel some legislation into federal parliament, challenge the Labor Party to do the right thing for once, and actually use that power to come in over the top of the states. God knows the federal governments have been doing that for the last 100 years and have got the states normally in the corner. And, of course, there's the issue of the dollars. And
but see,
I'd like to see that happen.
Campbell, it's also the deficit in decision-making, isn't it? There are other issues like the ABC. They pulled out of the High Court action initiated by Clive Palmer. You've got rogue premiers running Australia virtually as separate countries. There's the overreach of the Victorian police, the arrest of a young pregnant woman. I haven't heard a word from Scott Morrison about any of that. Australians being banned from travelling overseas, free speech at universities. Oh, yes, we've got another inquiry, but they won't be looking at Queensland University. Where is the government of Australia on these things, Campbell?
Well, Alan, this really starts to puzzle me. I have been a very big supporter of Scott Morrison for many years. I supported him throughout the summer of the bushfires. But I've got to say, I'm now responding to what I'm hearing from party rank and file and the base of the Liberal and National parties, and that is, what does he stand for? When will he have a fight on core values? When will he stand up for small business? When will he stand up for free speech in the universities? When will he absolutely condemn the stormtroopers of the Victorian Police High Command who think it's okay to arrest a woman in front of her kids in her pyjamas for simply putting on a Facebook post? I mean, these are all things that we expect leadership on, and sadly I say, because I have had a lot of respect for the guy in the past, we're not seeing that from the PM.
No. What about pre-selections in Queensland? You've got an election coming up. This bloke, Bartholomew, marvellous surfer. Labor have thrown him in as their candidate for that Gold Coast state seat of Burleigh, former world surfing champion, and an iconic surfing figure, I might add. And the LNP's Michael Hart holds the seat. Obviously, Labor think they can win it. He was $4 a couple of weeks ago. He's now $2.50 on Sportsbet. But the former Labor member for Burleigh, there's Christine Smith, who served in the Parliament from 2001 to 2012, resigned from the Labor Party due to her disgust with a candidate who only joined the Labor Party a month ago. But, of course, when you had the situation in Currumbin and Jan Stuckey left, the Liberal Party and the National Party did exactly the same thing, threw a person in over someone who the electorate wanted. What's going on, Campbell?
Well, across Australia, I think, Alan, we see this all the time these days. And my observation is that when you go and do this sort of star candidate from outside, captain's call pick, it usually goes pear-shaped. One thing about picking people who've come through the rank and file activities of political party branches is that they share the values. We were talking about values before, and that's critically important. I mean, you know, these sort of star candidates often then are the ones who betray the leader. They have no real affiliation to the hard-working men and women who do the work on the ground. You look at Julia Banks in the last few years. That's an example of the sort of thing that goes wrong, and it's ill-advised, and it really is a terrible snub to those hard-working and loyal party members.
Absolutely. And just what about that story at the weekend I read where the Queensland LNP have no party treasurer? So that means we're only, weeks away from an election and there's no one out there driving fundraising efforts. But I see Sportsbet, did you see this, Campbell? Sportsbet now have the Labor Party odds on in Queensland to win the October 31 election, $1.80.
Fundraising has been a big challenge for the LNP, Alan, and it's frankly, particularly because Anastasia Palaszczuk has tried to rig the election by actually setting it up so that people involved in the property industry, the development industry, cannot give donations. They're called prohibited donors. Imagine that, the discrimination against a class of people just because of the business that they're involved in, particularly when you put that on the state sphere. So that's an issue, and the LNP don't have a treasurer, and that's really regrettable. And I just really think the LNP are up against it on this one. They are clearly the underdogs, and I'm really, I take no pleasure from this, but what we're now seeing with Sportsbet is what I predicted back in April. It has there's a real sad chance that this whole election will slip away from the LNP, and that's really bad, Alan, because today we saw from the media that debt in Queensland within 12 months will hit over $100 billion. Over $100 billion. And by the way, the Labor Party today, a lot of the journalists just reported this like it was all okay. They're going to take $1 billion, give it to the Queensland Investment Corporation, get them to invest in small and medium-sized businesses in Queensland. Like it's just sort of, it's like it's the most bizarre doubling down by economic illiterates. Cameron Dick, the state treasurer, clearly clueless, you know, and during this pandemic, they've continued to employ more public servants. They've given them pay rises. Sort of one rule for the public sector, another rule for hard-working men and women, particularly in small business.
That's the point, Campbell, isn't it? I mean, it's a private sector recession. All of these people bleating instructions to us, the Jeanette Youngs on $600,000 a year, haven't lost a cent. Premiers haven't lost a cent. The Prime Minister, the Cabinet, they haven't lost a cent, but the private sector has been crushed. Just before you go, an interesting one, because she's been in the news right across Australia. Everyone knows Jackie Trad, seat of South Brisbane, but there's every suggestion now also, according to the polls, that she's going to win that seat ahead of the Greens, and the Liberal Party apparently are going to preference her ahead of the Greens. What do you make of Jackie Trad's chances? I mean, if she can win South Brisbane, there's not much hope for the coalition winning government.
Well, I think that everyone thought that Jackie Trad was gone for all money, and that report has been around now. I've got one theory, and that is that the Greens have been so heavily involved in this Extinction Rebellion nonsense in Brisbane that people perhaps are waking up to themselves that they're not for the environment. They're a bunch of watermelons, you know, green on the outside, red on the inside, just a bunch of Marxists communists who want to actually completely change the social order of our country, and maybe, just maybe, people are going, Jackie Trad, the Greens candidate, Jackie Trad, the Greens, OK, I'll go for Trad. She's pretty left too, mind you, Alan,
yes,
but once upon a time I did say years ago, on a few occasions, that I'd prefer to vote for the Labor Party for the next 100 years than to vote Greens once. And I'd counsel all Australians to think that way.
Yes, I agree. And just the other thing, of course, I suppose the leaders, if they were any value at a state level under this COVID business, Morrison and Albanese won't get into Queensland to campaign, I presume.
Well, no, they're not going to be here. And I think, given the popularity of the PM, which I alluded to before, I think that's a real disadvantage for Deb Freckling. I think he really could have boosted her chances. I think Anastasia would be quite happy for Anthony Albanese, who's so caught up and astride the barbed wire fence about coal. I love coal, says Anthony. I love the worker. I'm a worker. You know, he'd be up here in the high vis and the hard hats. I believe in coal. Look, smudged, dirty face. These are workers' hands. No, I don't think so. Anastasia would be thrilled.
You're on fire.
In fact,
you're on fire.
Here's a theory, Alan. Before I go, here's a theory. Perhaps these restrictions are about keeping Anthony Albanese out of the state so Palaszczuk can get on with
a political agenda there as well. Good to talk to you, Campbell. Talk to you next week. There we are.